Hi everyone. When I was 8 years old, something amazing happened at our primary school. There was a rumour going round that Kenny Swain's two sons were going to join our school. Now, that name might mean nothing to you, but in 1977, Kenny Swain was top scorer and centre forward for Chelsea Football Club, but we simply didn't believe the rumour. Our school was just a normal state school, it wasn't a private school. Why would Kenny Swain send his kids to Cottenham Park Primary School? But then one day, it happened. Ian and Gary Swain arrived in the playground. And then at football training after school, Kenny Swain turned up. And we were told that he would be coaching us all season. Incredible. This news struck fear into rival primary schools all over southwest London. We were only playing 7-a-side matches against other schools, but we were arriving at away games in a minibus driven by Kenny Swain. Life could hardly get better. But then it did. One day, one unforgettable day in 1978, Kenny Swain brought along to training his captain, the captain of Chelsea, Ray Wilkins. Ray Wilkins was a current full England midfield international, and I genuinely remember tackling Ray Wilkins in training. I remember our conversation afterwards. I was talking about headering the ball, and Ray Wilkins said, "No, Adrian, you head the ball, you don't header the ball." So why was this Ray Wilkins guy such a big deal? Because he was only 18 years old when he became the captain of Chelsea. 18! It was unheard of. It's never been done before, and it will almost certainly never happen again in future. He was special. There was no one else like him. And for the past 2 weeks, we have been following the progress of another unique, special, and famous teenager. This is week 3 of our series following the life of Joseph. So if you're joining us for the first time, here is a 60-second recap of the story so far. 2 weeks ago, we saw the 17-year-old Joseph getting preferential treatment from his dad, Jacob, who gave Joseph a coat of many colours to designate Joseph as his favourite son. But this understandably upset Joseph's brothers, who, as a result, decided to sell Joseph into slavery. That does seem like a bit of an overreaction, don't you think? But then again, Joseph did tell them some really annoying dreams. Last week, we heard the brothers lying about what happened to Joseph. They tell Jacob that a wild animal must have attacked and killed Joseph. After all, they say, here's his special coat with some blood on it. And so last time, we left Joseph in Egypt, where he'd been sold by some slave traders to Potiphar, who was the captain of Pharaoh's bodyguard. And all of that was Genesis chapter 37. So we eagerly turn the page to find out what happens to Joseph next. But he's not there. Joseph isn't mentioned at all in chapter 38. Instead, Genesis 38 takes us on what seems to be a totally unnecessary departure into another story altogether, before we come back to Joseph in chapter 39, and then we stay with Joseph every step of the way through to the end of chapter 50. So seeing as we are following in Joseph's footsteps, perhaps you and I should skip chapter 38 because it's got nothing to do with Joseph. But hang on, why is chapter 38 in there? What if it's not just an irrelevant sidetrack? And so we start reading, and we find that if it was a movie, it would be certificate 18. It's about one of Joseph's older brothers, Judah. Although we are interested in Joseph, number 11 in the batting order, this chapter is about Judah, who comes into bat at number 4. What are we told about Judah? Well, Judah and his wife Shua have 3 sons, Onan, and Shelah. And the oldest son, marries a woman called Tamar, but when dies, Judah says to Onan, Erd's younger brother, look, Onan, your older brother has died, and and Tamar never had any children, so Onan, I want you to step into your older brother's shoes. In fact, I want you to get into your older brother's bed. Onan, I'll give you Tamar, and then you and Tamar can have children, and they'll sort of count as Er's children, and sort of make up for the fact that your brother died childless. If this sounds vaguely familiar, it might be because the same sort of thing happened to Henry VIII. His older brother Arthur was married to Catherine of Aragon, but Arthur died before he and Catherine had any children. So Henry VIII was asked to step up and do the decent thing and marry his dead older brother's wife, which he did. And what a disaster that was, although it did indirectly lead to the foundation of the Church of England. But we can't get into all of that now. Back in Genesis 38, Onan thinks this is a terrible arrangement. Onan doesn't want to have kids with Tamar. Onan hates the idea that any children he has with Tamar will always be thought of as his older brother's kids. But it's been decided that this is how it has to be. It has to be this way. So Onan is stuck. How is Onan going to square the circle? How is Onan going to obey the rules, which means sleeping with Tamar, and at the same time make sure that Tamar never gets pregnant? What to do? I know, says Onan. Onan's solution has gone down in history as the most famous mention in the entire Bible of masturbation. And ever since, Genesis 38 has become a minefield for unsuspecting Sunday school teachers who wander innocently out of chapter 37 without realizing what's round the corner. Here is Onan's solution. The Bible says that when Onan slept with Tamar, he spilled his semen on the ground. It's not quite the same as masturbation. The commentators think that what Onan was doing with Tamar was pulling out just before the climactic moment. Anyway, none of this helps Tamar, as we will see when we throw the story on to the next brother, Shelah. Because first died, then Onan died. Sadly, Tamar is now a widow twice over, and so Judah promises Tamar that when his third son, Shelah, is old enough, she can marry Shelah. But Judah has no intention of giving Shelah to Tamar, because by this stage, Judah has decided that Tamar is bad news, because every son of his Tamar marries ends up dead. Now, to understand what Tamar does next, we're going to just have to jive with the fact that this was 3,700 years ago, and that back then in the Middle East, and this is still a thing in the Middle East today, Tamar would have felt under enormous social, economic, and religious pressure to keep the family line going. So let's bear in mind that Tamar was a very intelligent woman under pressure. In fact, the title of this message is When You're Under Pressure. When Tamar was told, your father-in-law is on his way to Timnah to shear his sheep, she took off her widow's clothes, covered herself with a veil to disguise herself, and then sat down at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah, for she saw that though Shelah had now grown up, she had not been given to him as his wife. So Judah had promised Tamar that she'd marry Shelah when Shelah had grown up. And so Tamar's been hanging on, hoping that Judah is going to honor his promise. But now she realizes that Judah is not going to keep his word. That Judah is a lying, deceitful so-and-so with no moral compass. So when she hears that Judah is on his way to Timnah, she sits down on the side of the road, knowing that Judah will be walking along that very same road sometime soon. So Tamar disguises herself, sits by the side of the roadside, and waits. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face, not realizing that she was his daughter-in-law. He went over to her by the roadside and said, "Come now, let me sleep with you." I think we can safely call that the direct approach. So Judah could have seen a woman who he thought was a prostitute and kept on walking to Timnah without stopping. Judah might have been tempted to talk to the prostitute, but then perhaps Judah would have thought, "Oh, no, hang on a minute. What am I thinking? No. I'm the grandson of Isaac. I'm the great-grandson of Abraham. I'm part of the family of God. God has looked out over the whole earth and chosen me and my family to carry his promises. And that's why I'm not going to say a word to this prostitute. I'm not stopping. I'm going to keep on walking to Timnah." But no. Judah thinks, there's a prostitute, no one's watching, failing to realize that the place where this happens is called Enaim, which is the Hebrew word for eyes. Judah, that was a clue that God can see what you're doing. So Judah walks over to her and says, "Come now, let me sleep with you." Judah, have you completely forgotten who you are? What are you doing? Tamar is much cleverer than Judah and is always one step ahead. "And what will you give me to sleep with you?" she asked. "I'll send you a young goat from my flock," he said. "Will you give me something as a pledge until you send it?" she asked. He said, "What pledge should I give you?" "Your seal and its cord and the staff in your hand," she answered. So he gave them to her and slept with her, and she became pregnant by him. After she left, she took off her veil and put on her widow's clothes again. Don't you love the honesty of the Bible? This episode could so easily have been edited out. Tamar's question, "What will you give me?" is dripping with irony because the whole point is that Judah did not give her Shelah. If Judah had given Tamar what he'd promised, we wouldn't be in this ridiculous situation. If Judah had given her Shelah, then we wouldn't have the disguise, the prostitution, the incest, and the whole, "If you have sex with me, I promise you a goat." Yeah, right. How do I know I'll ever receive this hypothetical goat? Because here's my credit card. Oh, and my passport, which you can keep until the goat arrives. The whole thing is a fiasco. Let's go to the conclusion of the story. Tamar sent a message to Judah, her father-in-law. "I am pregnant by the man who owns these," she said. And she added, "See if you recognize whose seal and cord and staff these are." Judah recognized them and said, "She is more righteous than I, since I wouldn't give her to my son Shelah." And Tamar then gives birth to twin boys called Perez and Zerah. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that was a racy story, which was rather shocking, but so what? Why do we have to listen to this? Isn't this entirely inappropriate? Answer, no. Because it was through the sex between Judah and Tamar that Jesus Christ came into the world. Judah and Tamar never slept together again. They'd never slept together before. It was this one time. This one sexual encounter is how come you know Jesus. Judah slept with his daughter-in-law, who was at the time disguised as a prostitute. That's how come Jesus got born. This is massive. So this is how the New Testament begins. This is an account of the origin of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, Judah the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. So rather than this being the most inappropriate Mother's Day talk ever, it turns out that if you are a woman who is under pressure, or if you are a mother, but your life has not been like a pleasant walk in the park on a sunny day, if your life has been as hard as Tamar's was, it could be that God is at work in you and through you to accomplish something magnificent. Like Tamar, God is at work in you to bring Jesus to people. In fact, if we had time, we could tell an equally amazing story about all 4 of the people in pink whose names are on the screen. So if you are in a desperate situation, if, like Tamar, men have not kept their promises and lied to you and deceived you and you've been driven to your wits' end, don't count God out of the picture. Because in Tamar's case, well, look, it was through her son Perez that Jesus was descended on both sides of his family. So if you are someone who thinks that all this church and God stuff is all about, I don't know, being good, not swearing, it's all very nice, but it's not for real people who go through real pressure and real tragedy, well, we can see that God is real enough and loving enough to work through the mess to bring the Messiah, Jesus, into the world. In the book of Revelation in heaven, Jesus is called the Lion of the tribe of Judah. It's a name of honor for Jesus in heaven. But today, we've seen how Jesus was descended from Judah. We saw in shocking detail how it actually happened. Now, you may never have been driven to the extremes that Tamar was. But if you've been driven to distraction by your circumstances, don't rule God out of your circumstances. There is hope for all of us, even in the most challenging situations. Okay, very briefly then, what of our friend Joseph? What's Joseph been up to all this time? Well, Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. The Lord was with Joseph. Joseph found favor in Potiphar's eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. Something similar happened 100 years ago at Selfridge's in Oxford Street. The great American-born entrepreneur Gordon Selfridge was building his famous department store. He got a new assistant, but what he didn't know was that his new assistant was a Bible-believing Christian. The phone rang and Selfridge called out, "Tell them I'm not in." But his assistant answered the call by saying, "Mr. Selfridge is right here. Let me put you through to him." As soon as the call was over, Gordon Selfridge was furious. "What are you doing? If I tell you I'm not in, you tell anyone who rings that I'm not in." To which the Christian assistant replied, "Mr. Selfridge, if I can lie for you, I can lie to you." Rather than being angry, it was a turning point in the development of the business. From that day on, Gordon Selfridge trusted his new assistant with everything. Something similar was happening to Joseph working in Potiphar's house. In our old church, we have a friend called Laura who left a business career to become a teacher, and when she qualified and started her first teaching job, she was really dismayed at how low morale was in the staff room. During break time, all the teachers were sitting on their own. It was a really bad atmosphere. And Laura was told that one of the things that was happening was that all the teachers in the staff room were bringing in their own milk to make a cup of tea at break, and each teacher was writing their name on with a marker pen on their own milk, But of course, at break time, some teachers couldn't be bothered. They were just going to the fridge, taking someone's milk. So, when you finally get to make yourself a cup of tea, you discover all your milk's been nicked. Now, Laura's only been at this school for 5 days. Monday of week 2, she stops off on the way to school, buys a 4-pinter of milk. She puts that in the fridge, no name on it. Is this your milk, Laura? No, that's everyone's milk. Laura told me how she did this every day, 4-pinter. And slowly, the atmosphere changed. Something similar was happening through Joseph in Potiphar's house. You may know, or you may be interested to know, that our group of churches was founded by a man called Terry Virgo. Terry Virgo became a Christian as a result of his sister arriving back in Brighton, saying that she had found Jesus in a church in London. She then got a job as a secretary, and her boss said she was fun. She was the best secretary I ever had. But when it came to talking about anything serious, it was as if she was from a different planet. That's the kind of impact Joseph made in Potiphar's house. Joseph was the best secretary that Potiphar had ever had. One last story. When I was at school, there was one boy who really struggled, not socially, but academically. Socially, he was really popular, very smiley, but he just found the actual schoolwork incredibly hard. Anyway, I subsequently prayed for this guy that he would become a Christian. I was praying for him for about 10 years. I met him again 2 years ago at my 50th birthday party. He said, "Do you know, I've recently discovered I'm dyslexic." He said, "And I thought you'd be interested to know, Adrian, that in 2005 I walked into a mega church in Kuala Lumpur and I've become a Christian." I said, "That is fantastic. What are you doing now?" He said, "I work for a bank." I said, "Oh, what do you do for them?" He said, "Well, I won't tell you his answer, because if I do tell you his answer, then you'll be able to find him on LinkedIn." I said, "Wow, how many staff do you oversee?" He said, 8,400. Like Joseph, he'd found that once you're in the world of work, it's not about your GCSE grades or your A-level grades. It's about you and your character. This guy, he now loves God and he loves people. And just recently at the bank, he's been rewarded time and again for his integrity. In the same way, Joseph proved himself trustworthy, and that's why he got promoted. Jane's going to come back later and just bring some of these different threads together. But now we're going to worship again, and I'm going to hand back to Tim.